There in Facebook land. This is Brother Michael Champion coming to you. I'm very excited. Well, I've been saying that for the past several weeks, but I'm really excited about some of the lessons that we're going to be going into, the main study tonight. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the rise of Nimrod, and we'll get into a little bit about the building of the Tower of Babel. Now, as I mentioned last week, I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about Semiramis, the legendary wife of Nimrod, and we're probably not going to get much into that. Hey, Liz, good to have you here. We got people rolling in already. It's good to see. Last week, the past few weeks, we've been looking at a lot of history. Sometimes when you study the Bible, there's going to be really a whole bunch of history that you get into to study it. Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 5 is one of those. Another place is Genesis chapter 10. And usually, if it's a place where you got to dig in for history, a good indicator of that, and that it's going to be a historical study, if you will, it's because it's going to be genealogies, because those genealogies allow you to properly date certain things, and they also tell you what was going on in the world at that time based on hidden meanings of names and so forth. And we've done one on the rise of the pre-flood civilization. Then we went into the days of Noah. Last week, we talked about the rise of post-flood civilization, about what was going on between the time of the flood and the rising, the building of the Tower of Babel. Last week we stopped the lesson. After we gone about an hour, we stopped the lesson right at the building of the Tower of Babel, and we began to look a little bit about what was going on in the world with the idolatry on the rise, with the wars that was going on and so forth. And what I want to do, I want to pick up with that and do a little bit of a background study, get a little bit of a backdrop, go back a little bit, and talk about some of the things that we did last week, because I think it's very important to give us a good running start for what we're about to study. Now, I'm going to start reading tonight in Genesis chapter 10. Like I said, this is basically where we begin to leave off a little bit. Genesis chapter, right where the Tower of Babel is going to be built. Now, watch this. Genesis chapter 10. Now, this is a whole list of genealogies going on here, and I want to kind of condense this whole chapter. That way, we don't go through a whole bunch of names here. Genesis chapter 10, verse 1 says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Unto them were sons born after the flood." So from that point to the end of the chapter, all it is a list of all the men that was born just after and the centuries after the flood. And it ends that chapter with verse 32 saying this: "These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." Now, what this tells us is that after the flood, at some point, they began to spread out and establish the precursors of the nations. For example, we read about let me throw you a few names out here: Magog and Gog, and Tubal and Tushak, or Meshach. These are all descendants of Japheth, and they all settled in the European area to form the European nations. And then you have Ham, who went down and settled in the African continent, and he had sons like Cush, which his Ethiopian, actually Ethiopia was named. The Greek name for Cush is Ethiopia, and that's where you get that land from. You also have that came out of Cush would be Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, and also Canaan, which became very important later on down the road. Good deal. We got Jennifer here. Great. Glad to have you here, girl. And Canaan becomes very significant, as we're going to look at here in a minute. And so all these nations begin to branch out. And we have, toward the end of this chapter, we have, in verse 21 of chapter 10, we have Shem's lineage. And you get down to about, right at verse 25, it says, "And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan." Now, what that means is Joktan means to be shortened or to be lessened, and that tells us that in his day there was a something that was going on that actually got shortened, and we find out last week that was the life expectancy. People just were not living to be near as long at this time. First they were living to be at 600, then they dropped down to 400, and right around the time of Peleg and Joktan, just like that, everybody dropped down to about 200 years of age. So that's pretty profound when you look at it, and scientists study this out, and I have a tendency to agree with them, that this was actually when the atmospheric conditions began to get so drastic that it began to shorten the lengths of people. And when people were born into the world, they just could not, their bodies couldn't handle the change in climates and so forth. And then Peleg's name, of course, means to be divided, and it was in his day and time that everybody had been allotted at their particular time when Noah went out with his sons, according to the book of Jubilees, and divided up the earth. And that's exactly what we have found, because Peleg was born 100 years after the flood. And if you think about that, within about 100 years, everything began to get shortened and life expectancy, and the world was divided. But it's very important that we understand that the world was divided and allotted up between Noah's sons long before Nimrod was even born, let alone the Tower of Babel was constructed. And that's why I think verse 32 of chapter 10 is very important. It says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So you have the whole world being divided up. The children of Shem was going one way, the children of Japheth was going into Europe, the children of Ham was going down to Africa, and right after that story that we have in the Bible, we have the building of the Tower of Babel. Hey, Jordan, Vicky, and Shannon, how y'all doing? It's good to have y'all here tonight. Now, look at what we got going on. Let's go ahead and jump at some of this stuff. It sounds like we're going to be doing a review, but that's okay too. According to Jubilees chapter 8, verse 2, I'm just going to refer to it because I read it last week out of the book. There was a man by the name of Canaan, and he's very important in the post-flood world. We're going to find out more about that tonight. He went to look for a city to take and for him to have for himself at the time that Peleg was coming up of age and he was being born. And we have the people dividing out the world. And it's kind of interesting because we looked at the ancient pre-flood city of Enoch, which was founded by Cain, who after he murdered his brother. And last week we found out the connection between Enoch in Genesis chapter 4, the city of Enoch, and the city of Erech in Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, which was the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom. Now, think about this. Now, if Canaan went looking for a city to call his own, that he would have his own city, what all was exactly going on there? The book of Jubilees tells us that Canaan found, he could read and write, and he found forbidden knowledge from the Watchers. Now, if you know about anything about the Watchers, they brought about idolatry. These fallen angels did. They taught the art of war. They taught astrology. They taught all forms of sorcery, and made a connection to what you and I would call demonology. Okay? Now, all this got started with the Canaanites, or the man Canaan and his descendants. And it doesn't take long to realize why Canaan was cursed, because he began to dig up all this stuff. Now, what was going on? If all the nations were divided, and I know that for a lot of people that's new, they thought, oh, I thought the sin was that they didn't replenish the earth. The Bible never says that. If you take the Bible at face value and look at what it says that the nations were divided first, and then the Tower of Babel was built. And I know, here, let's take a look at that real quick. Genesis chapter 11, right after we read that the nations were divided in all the earth, it says this, verse 1 of 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. I want to read something to you. As many of you know, I have written a few books, and this is one of the books that I wrote. It's called Nimrod and Semiramis. You might be able to find that on Amazon somewhere if you're interested in some more information. And on page 12 and 13, I basically break down with the original language of all the key words in the study of the Tower of Babel, the first 9 verses of chapter 9. I want to share with you some of these meanings. If you look at it, it says that the whole earth was of one language and one speech. That literally means that there was one dialogue that they were speaking. They were connected by language, and it says that they journeyed from the east. And what that means is it can mean to leave or to be pulled up or out of, but it can also mean to be led or to lead. And that's very interesting, because that means that if the theory that I'm putting forth here that the nations were already divided, then that means something in the Middle East would have brought the Europeans back. It would have brought the Africans back. Something would have happened in the central Middle Eastern area. So the question is, what could have brought them back? I want to share something with you. Like I said, we looked at. It says that the Canaanites they revived idolatry. They became very warlike. They had introduced astrology and sorcery, and through the idolatry, demonology, and demons began to come in. And we looked on 1 Corinthians 19. Um, oh, I missed that verse. 1 Corinthians. Let me look at that because I want to give you all the right verse. Okay, I know what verses is, but I can't believe I just found. I just looked at this as many times I looked at it today. 1 Corinthians. I want to make sure. I think it's chapter 10 is where it is. I believe chapter 10, and it is chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It says, starting in verse 19. What say I then, that the idol is anything, or that which is offered to sacrifice to idols is anything? Verse 20. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice unto devils and not to God, and I would not have you that you should have fellowship with devils. What Paul is saying is that behind every false god there is a devil. And when the Canaanites brought into this aspect of idolatry, they actually introduced the world, okay? They introduced the world to war, and more than that, they introduced the world to blood sacrifices. Now, for those of you who've heard me do a lot of talking about the book of Jasher, I want to give y'all an idea of how gross and how terrible this idolatry really was. And this is what I'm going to read to you from the book of Jasher, chapter, get my glasses back on here. What I'm going to read to you from the book of Jasher, chapter 31. I'm going to read verse 40 and 44 here in a minute, and it's going to tell you stuff. But you can understand, all this is building up to the building of the Tower of Babel, and this is the world that Nimrod grew up in. He grew up in idolatry. He grew up in war. He grew up in astrology as being a chief religion. And we're going to see that demonology was a big the worship of demons that was very prevalent. We just looked at in the Word of God. I want to show you something. Look at what Jasher chapter 31 says. Jasher chapter 31. And I know some of you got a copy of this, some of you don't, but that's okay. I think I posted a link one time a few weeks ago where you could actually find this book online if you want to add it to your library, which I'd highly recommend if you love history, and especially the history of the Bible. It's got some good stuff in it. Mine's falling apart. I need to use my newer version of it. Jasher chapter 31, starting in verse 41 and going to 44. Listen to what it says. Now, by the way, this is when Rebecca... this is when Rachel was going back with Jacob, and Laban had begun to pursue him because he was taking Jacob was taking his wives. He was taking the wives' handmaidens, and he was taking all his children back. And Laban began to pursue him. And this is why look at what the book of Jasher, chapter 31, starting in verse 41, has to say about these idols that Rachel had stolen. We all know the story there, or most of us do. It says this. And this is the manner of the images in taking a man who is the firstborn and slaying him, and taking the hair off his head, and taking salt and salting the head and anointing it in oil, then taking a small tablet of copper or a tablet of gold and writing the name upon it, and placing the tablet under its tongue, and taking the head taking the head with the tablet under the tongue and putting it in the house, and lighting up lights before it and bowing down to it. Verse 42. And at the time when they bow down to it, get this, it speaketh to them in all manner that they should ask of it through the power of the name which was written in it. Now keep in mind, these are familiar spirits that are attaching themselves to Laban's dolls, and Rachel took these idols so Laban couldn't find where Jacob was going, which he ultimately did anyway. Verse 43, and some make them in figures of men, of gold and silver, and go to them in times unknown to them, and the figures receive the influence of the stars and tell them future things. And in this manner were the images that Rachel stole from her father, and Rachel stole these images which were her father's, in order that Laban might not know through them where Jacob had gone. Now